Afternoon, everybody. I'm Mickey Keenan. I'm really Scott's technical support today. One of the things that we're very aware of is the accents. Northern Ireland accents can be quite difficult, so we're both learning how to talk slow. So I will keep prompting Scott to talk slow. He talks faster than me. But Scott is doing the presentation today, and I'll just sit out of the way and read newspaper. Okay, so
Perfect.
enjoy this presentation because it's one that I really enjoy myself. Okay?
Mickey, that's great, and that was perfect pace. Just keep it.
Okay.
Keep it.
Right. See you later.
I've got to live up to that pace. Uh, so on that, actually, when I'm talking today, I plan on starting slow. However, I may speed up as we go through the presentation. If at any time I do talk too fast and people want to interrupt me to remind me to slow down, please feel free to do so. So, first of all, my name is Scott Graham. I'm a PhD researcher here at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. And the first thing I want to say is just thank you to Corel and Alina for giving me the opportunity to share some of my research, which is something that I'm both professionally and personally invested in. So before we get into looking at my research, though, I want to give a bit of an introduction to the topic of inclusive education. So, inclusion. Although there is no universally agreed upon definition of what inclusion is within the education system, it is generally thought of as the goal of teaching children with special education needs, or SENS, within mainstream education settings, alongside non-SEN students. Now, given that inclusive education is very much a real thing and happening in our world right now, there's been research into its effects. And research shows that when it is done well, it can result in positive social and academic outcomes for both SEN and non-SEN students. And my research is really looking at those social outcomes. Furthermore, research shows that there is generally a notion of approval for the idea of inclusion within the general public and amongst many teachers themselves. So in the class, the teacher has two broad responsibilities. First, to teach all of the children within the class, and also to ensure that all of the students' social, emotional, and behavioural needs are met. So, as you can imagine, this is extremely stressful for the teacher. Indeed, research shows that there are many teachers who, although they support the notion of inclusive education, are quite apprehensive and feel quite ill-prepared to work within inclusive education settings. For example, the research shows that some teachers state that some research shows that teachers voice concerns about their abilities to teach both SEN and non-SEN students within the same classroom at the same time. Some teachers voice concerns about their ability to manage potentially higher rates of disruptive behaviour within the classroom, with research showing high prevalence rates of behaviours of concern among children often provided with a SEN label. And finally, or at least the last point that I'll mention here tonight, is that some teachers voice concerns about their ability to create truly inclusive environments. Inclusion is more than simply having a SEN student within the classroom. That's simply physical integration. Rather, what we need for true inclusion is the social participation of all students within the classroom, and we need to create classrooms and communities of belonging, acceptance, and understanding. So what teachers need is they need evidence-based, easy-to-use interventions that will allow them to move away from feeling worried and apprehensive to happy and confident working within those settings. And perhaps the good inclusion game can contribute towards teachers being able to do just that. Now, the good inclusion game is not just about the teachers, it's also about the students. And rather than attempt to go through an extensive body of research to explain why the good inclusion game might benefit some SEND students, I'm going to tell a little bit of a personal story. So I'm sure if I was to ask you to raise your hand if you could spell the word when you were perhaps 8, 9, 10 years old, most of you would raise your hand. However, believe it or not, this kid couldn't. And this kid's me. And I remember being in those situations in which I couldn't remember how to spell really, really simple words, such as when. And I remember feeling really, really stupid. And the last thing I was going to do was turn around to one of my friends and ask for help because I was embarrassed. I kind of knew I should be able to spell that word at 8, 9, 10 years old. And I believe that I suffer from those experiences to this day, in that they've had a massive impact upon my self-esteem. I still very much label myself the stupid kid. Nowadays, though, with my knowledge of behaviorism, I often look back at those experiences and I talk to that kid within myself, if you will, and I say things like, well, Scott, you know dyslexia is just a summary label now. There's nothing wrong with you. If anything, it was just bad teaching. And although I truly, truly believe those things, there's still this other thought that often creeps in. So as you can imagine, it was terrible having those thoughts as a kid, and it's not much fun having those thoughts or types of thoughts to this day when they do creep in. But I tell you that to show you that the types of experiences that children have within the classroom not only impact them in the moment, but also can have an impact later in life. And I'm not the only one. These two kids here are my nephews, and I believe it's reasonable to assume that if they live through experiences similar to mine, they'll actually end up with the same types of thoughts, such as I am stupid and I have low self-esteem. And of course, none of us want our kids or our clients or our students to feel that way. So I do say all of that to paint this picture of this research, which suggests that, as I said, the experiences that children have within classrooms can not only impact them in the classroom, but also later in life. And my research is directly concerned with those more immediate effects. So the good inclusion game has two broad aims. The first aim is to help teachers working within inclusive education settings to feel more confident, and also to increase the social participation of SEND students, but also all students. That's really what inclusion is about. So really, it's to show kids it's okay to ask for help. And that's especially an important skill for SEND kids who by definition do require more help. And also to teach SEND students that, you know what, you're probably in a position where you can help some of your friends yourselves. Now, before we move on, it might be important to note why we are looking at class-wide interventions to help with these goals. And here I'm going to be quite brief. But this is an important consideration because we know the importance of individualized, person-centered interventions. We know how to teach and promote social skills to individuals, how to develop behavior support plans, etc. So why do we just do that? Well, basically, the main reason is that in a classroom, the classroom consists of more than one student. And therefore, if you are a teacher with multiple individualized interventions, this can be extremely difficult to do with any level of treatment integrity. And by that, I just mean implementing the plans as they are written and as expected. Moreover, the research shows, or some research shows, that individualized interventions can also be stigmatizing to the recipient of those interventions. So if you imagine I am the only one in a classroom with a token board on my table, this can lead to me being stigmatized by my peers. Whereas class-wide interventions are often more efficient because the teacher can change the behavior of multiple students with one intervention. And these class-wide interventions can contribute to the culture found within the classroom. Now, what is important to note is that when we are talking about class-wide interventions, we are really talking about group contingencies. Or, in other words, contingencies that are applied to the behavior of a group of individuals. Now, there are a number of different group contingencies, so I feel it's important that we spend some time looking at these. And the first one we'll talk about here is called the independent group contingency. And the independent group contingency is quite similar to an individual contingency system in that each student receives a consequence contingent on their own behavior. The difference is, under an independent group contingency, the same contingency is in place for all group members. So let me explain. Imagine this student here meets the criterion, whatever that may be. Let's say, for example, you have to stay in your seat for 15 minutes in order to earn a star. Well, this student met the criterion, and therefore they earn a star. This student here met the criterion, and again, they earned a star. This is different from an individual contingency system in that the teacher may be targeting individual target behaviors, and there may be different reinforcers. But under an independent group contingency, it's the same target behaviors with the same reinforcer and the same criterion. This student here, however, let's say did not meet the criterion, and therefore he, she, or they do not get the star. This student here meets the criterion, and they get the star, and this student does not meet the criterion, and therefore does not get the star. So that's the independent group contingency. We then have another group contingency called the dependent group contingency, in which reinforcement for the entire class is contingent on the behavior of a single individual within the group, or sometimes a subgroup of individuals within the larger group. So for example, if we imagine that this student here is the target student, the student whose behavior is responsible for meeting the contingency requirement, well, in this case, this student did not meet the criterion. They did not stay in their seat for 15 minutes, and therefore no one earns the reward or the prize. However, if the criterion was applied to this student's behavior, not only would the students who actually met the criterion earn access to the prize, but also the other students as well. And for this reason, sometimes the dependent group contingency is referred to as the hero procedure, because for all of the other students, the purple kid here is a hero because their behavior brought forth the prize or the reward, if you will. And then finally, we have another group contingency called an interdependent group contingency, in which reinforcement for the entire class is contingent on some collective group performance. And there's different ways of doing this. But for this example, if we imagine that the criterion was that 4 out of 5 students had to stay in their seat for the reward to be provided, in this case, the criterion was not met. However, if the criterion was 3 out of 5 students, then the criterion was met, and all of the students would earn access to that reward. And this is really where the research comes in. Indeed, this research here that we have on the screen is very much a stepping stone for my PhD. And Coyle and Dillenberger from Queen's University in Belfast, they developed what's called the good inclusion game. And these are the first two studies published on the good inclusion game itself. Now, the good inclusion game is a variation of the good behavior game, which is a class-wide intervention known to many behavior analysts. However, I am aware that many of you will probably not know what the good behavior game is, so I'm going to go through some of the basic components of the original version of the game right now. And I'll do that for a number of reasons. First of all, just to bring your awareness to another intervention called the good behavior game, but also because Coyle and Dillenberger compared the good inclusion game to the good behavior game. Okay, so the good behavior game is an intervention built on the interdependent group contingency. So that was the last group contingency that we looked at there, in which reinforcement for the entire class is contingent on some average group performance. And within the good behavior game, there are a number of components. So typically, the teacher will take the class and divide it up into a number of teams. Then, following this, the teacher will typically advise the class of the rules of the game, which are typically focused on reducing disruptive behaviors. So, for example, you're to stay in your seat, or you're not to get out of your seat, I guess, and you're not to talk out. Whilst playing the game, contingent on rule violations, the teacher will deliver demerits, or conditioned punishers, or what you might refer to as negative points. These are points that you do not want to get. Prior to playing the game, the students are typically made aware of a predetermined criterion. So, for example, you're not to get more than 5 demerits. And contingent upon meeting this criterion, rewards are provided. So these are the 5 components of the good behavior game: teams, rules, feedback, criterion, and rewards. Now, the good inclusion game, being a variation of the good behavior game, is quite similar, however, with 2 key differences. Rather than the rules of the good inclusion game focusing on reducing disruptive behaviors, the good inclusion game focuses on increasing inclusive behaviors, or what I call helping, sharing, and caring. And rather than giving demerits or conditioned punishers or negative points, we provide points, or positive points, or what you might refer to as conditioned reinforcers, or in this case, merits as well. So I don't have time to go through the Coyle and Dillenberger studies today in detail, but what I will say is they were replications of each other, so they're very similar. And the other thing I will say is they measured the dependent variables that we have here on the screen. By dependent variables, I simply just mean the behaviors that we have here on the screen. And they measured these dependent variables under a number of conditions, so baseline, the good inclusion game, and indeed that original version of the good behavior game that I just laid out there for you. And when measuring these dependent variables, they had 2 different levels of analysis. So you can see here there's the individual level of analysis and the group level of analysis. So the inclusive interactions were recorded at the individual level. That is, they had a target SEND student and they recorded interactions between that student and their peers, as opposed to class-wide interactions. And there was a reason for doing that, and I'll explain what it was in a minute or two. But as you can see here from these inclusive interactions, really what we're looking at here is asking for help, offering help, physically responding correctly, and verbally responding correctly. So for example, what's 2 plus 2? That would be requesting information, asking for help. And then if a peer says to me 4, that's them verbally responding correctly. So you can see here by these types of behaviors, the main aim of the good inclusion game is really to increase helping interactions among the students. And Coyle and Dillenberger, they selected these types of behaviors, let's call them broadly communicating and sharing, to be the inclusive behaviours as they align with the Index for Inclusion, which is a set of materials to guide schools through a process of inclusive school development. Specifically, Hoyle and Dillenberger stated that these behaviours align with indicator A1.1 and A1.2. Everyone is made to feel welcome and students are helping each other out. So let's look at how the researchers recorded interactions at that individual level and why they did so. So imagine these are 4 students sitting at a table cluster. This student here with the yellow box around them is our target SEN student. The researcher is recording interactions between that target SEN student and their peers. The SEN student may be asking for help, they may be offering help, they may be handing over rulers and rubbers. That's not so important. What's important is we're recording interactions between SEN and peer. Now, peer-to-peer interactions will obviously be ongoing, but the researcher's not recording those. The researcher is only recording these interactions right here. And they did this to see if the good inclusion game truly increases inclusive interactions between SEN and non-SEN students. Does the good inclusion game increase the social participation of the SEN student within the classroom? As there's a lot of research to suggest that SEN students do not participate to the same level as non-SEN students within inclusive education environments. So if the researchers were to record all of these interactions, for example, without distinguishing between SEN to peer interactions and peer to peer interactions, what might happen is the data could show an improvement. But it may be due to an increase in peer to peer interactions while the SEN student is effectively excluded. So to avoid that, they decided to just record SEN to peer interactions, and so have I in my research as well. So the interactions were measured at the individual level with a target SEN student in mind. However, the disruptive behaviours were measured at the class-wide level. And what Coyle and Dillenberger found was, in terms of the good behaviour game at least, is that it was associated with significant reductions in disruptive behaviours, however little change in inclusive interactions or helping, sharing and caring. The good inclusion game, however, was associated with increases in helping, sharing and caring and reductions in disruptive behaviours, however to a lesser extent than the good behaviour game, however still effective. So what we have here is an intervention that can potentially help both teachers and students with many of the concerns we discussed at the start of the presentation. And this leads into my research. In this first study, we had 2 questions. Our first question was, what is the effects, or what are the effects of the good inclusion game over a prolonged period of time? So one of the things I didn't tell you when talking very briefly there about the Coyle and Dillenberger studies is that each classroom was actually only exposed to one 15-minute good inclusion game session. And therefore, the researchers did not replicate the effects of the intervention within a single classroom, and they did not demonstrate the effects of one of the key components of the intervention itself, the reinforcement component. And therefore, it's possible that the game was effective simply because it was novel and may not be effective over time. If it's not effective over time, then this intervention is limited at best. Our second question was, well, do we have to play the good inclusion game with its points, criterion, teams, and what have you? Or can we simply just tell the students to help, share, and care for each other and praise them for doing so? So the data we're going to look at comes from a single mainstream primary school classroom here in Northern Ireland. And here we have some of the demographic information on the screen. So we had 18 pupils within the classroom whom we had assent and consent. They were 9 to 10 years old. And as I said, similar to Coyle and Dillenberger, we had a target SEN student. In this classroom, our target SEN student was female, and had an anxiety disorder, and we had the same female teacher throughout implementing the interventions. We also measured a number of dependent variables similar to that of Coyle and Dillenberger. However, we also included an additional dependent variable, or behavior, or response, which we referred to as positive or general comments. Now, although these types of interactions, positive and general comments, are not necessarily related to helping each other, they are aligned with the essence of inclusion. In that, it could be argued that these types of interactions could lead to one developing a sense of belongingness, i.e. being included, which, according to inclusive education research, is vitally important. Now, given that we are working within education settings, we deemed it important that these positive or general comments had to also be task-related, as we didn't want our data to imply or suggest that the good inclusion game was leading to off-topic interactions. And when we measured these dependent variables, we measured them separately in the moment, and then we later aggregated them to produce two measures. So here we have the helping interactions, which is excluding the positive or general comments, and this is very much what Coyle and Dillenberger measured. And then we had an overarching dependent variable or measurement, which we referred to as inclusive interactions. And that's just putting all of those together, helping and positive and general interactions. We also measured two teacher behaviors. However, I don't have time to go through those data here tonight. And the data we will look at were measured using a 20-second partial interval recording procedure. Now, I assume some of you may not know what that is, so I'm going to explain, so you can kind of picture what I was doing in the classrooms. So what you do is you take the data sheet, and here I'm showing the first 5.5 minutes or so, and you divide it up into a number of intervals. In this case, 20-second intervals. And then you just start your timer, you start a session. So let's imagine in the first 20 seconds, the SEND student requests help at the 7th second. So here you have the SEND student saying, what is 2 plus 2? So as you can see down here, the key R stands for requesting information or an item. So we can go ahead and score that off as a request happening within that 20-second interval period. Then in the 9th second, peer says 4. So as you can see here with the key, V stands for verbally responding, appropriately, I guess. And we can go ahead and score that within that 20-second period as well. Then in the 15th second, the SEND kid says, what's 2 times 2? Well, here when using a partial interval recording procedure, we don't score that because we've already indicated on our data sheet that this student has already requested help within that 20-second period. And the same can go for the verbally responding correctly within the 17th second. So when we're using partial interval recording procedures, we record if the behavior occurs at any time throughout the interval, but it doesn't have to occur throughout the entire interval. And it can occur multiple times, but we just indicate that it occurred. We don't have to say that it happened multiple times. And then to give you a little bit more of an example, if we move on in this pretend interaction with these students, we see that in the 52nd second, the peer says to the SEND student, hey, do you need help? So in our key down below, we can see that O here stands for offering information. So that's like, do you need help? So we can go ahead and score that off. Then in the 55th second, the SEND student says, yeah, I'm not too sure what to do here. So that's verbally responding correctly to that offer for help. So we can go ahead and score that off. And then in the 58th second, the peer says, let me look. So we can go ahead and score that off. Now the interaction continues into that next 20-second period. And the SEND student says, oh, you're doing the wrong question. So again, we can go ahead and score that off because it's now in the next 20-second period. The SEND student then says, oh, that's why. So now we have him verbally responding correctly again. So we can score that off. And finally, the peer says it's an easy mistake to make at 1 minute and 3 seconds in. So again, we don't score that because we've already indicated on our data sheet that this peer has verbally responded correctly within that 20-second period. And then what we do at the end of the session is we take the total number of intervals scored and divide that by the total number of intervals and multiply that number by 100. So for example, the data we have here, we had 3 intervals scored, the first interval, the third interval, and the fourth. And we can divide that by the total number of intervals that we have here on the screen, which is 14. And we multiply that number by 100, and that gives us a percentage of 21%. So with the data we see here on the screen, we can say that 21% of the intervals was scored with inclusive interactions. And actually more specifically here, helping interactions, because it was a request for help and then an offer of help. And I hope that makes sense. And I'm happy to take questions at the end, as we said. So here, I just want to show you the order of the conditions in the experiment before I talk about what those conditions look like. So here, first of all, we had baseline, and then we followed that by a condition that we refer to as inclusive instruction and modified praise. This was then followed by the good inclusion game, and then we alternated between the conditions throughout the remainder of the experiment. And as you can see there on the y-axis, we have percentage of intervals because we used that 20-second partial interval recording procedure. And on the x-axis, we have sessions. So we had 34 sessions within this experiment. So now let me tell you a little bit about the conditions. So first, baseline. What that is just me simply sitting in the classroom, observing the teacher and the students under standard teaching practices. There was really just praise and reprimands for appropriate and inappropriate behavior. And to be honest, praise was usually reserved for academic responding as opposed to social interactions among the students. So let's look at the level of helping interactions during that initial baseline phase. And here you can see the amount of help I observed in that original baseline phase. Quite low, relatively speaking to the remainder of the data we're going to see in a minute or two. So after this, as I said, we introduced that phase of inclusive instruction and modified praise. So what did that look like? Well, basically what it looked like was the teacher would give the students their work. However, before they started, she very explicitly told them that she expected to see them helping, sharing, and caring for each other. So she provided examples and non-examples of what that looked like. And then during the session, as she observed those types of behaviors, helping, sharing, and caring, she provided praise. And now let's look at what that did to the data. And this is just the helping interactions here. So you can see that this made a little change to the level of responding. It increased slightly. Now let's look at the good inclusion game. So in this classroom, the class were split up into 2 teams. They were then advised of the aim of the game. And in this classroom, the aim of the game was to earn 5 points in order to earn a reward or a prize. And they could get points by helping, sharing, and caring for each other. The teacher then put up an expectation poster on the wall, a scoreboard for the 2 teams, played the game for a maximum of 15 minutes, intermittently praised and delivered points to students and teams contingent upon observing those helping, sharing, and caring behaviours. And at the end, contingent upon teams having at least 5 points, provided the reward. And in all my studies, the teacher determined what the reward would be. Sometimes it was little tangible items, little toys, and other times it was, 5 minutes extra on the laptop or the iPad, or 5 minutes extra break time or recess. And now let's look at the effects the good inclusion game had on helping interactions. So here you can see that the good inclusion game increased the level of helping interactions. Now you'll notice that this data is quite variable. It goes up and down. I'll talk about that in a minute or two, and I'll address it when I present the entire data set. The other thing you might notice is that following this phase, we went back to baseline. And you might be wondering, well, why would you remove an effective intervention? Well, basically, we want to be sure that the good inclusion game was responsible for the behavior change. Indeed, if you look at the data closely, one might argue, or one might say, that it looked like the behavior was naturally increasing over time, and therefore it was nothing to do with the good inclusion game. So to address this concern, or this point, we change and alternate between different conditions, as you can see here. And now I'm just going to show you the baseline. So we went back to baseline, and that produced a reduction in helping interactions between our target student and her peers. And it allowed us to recapture similar levels of response to the original baseline phase. Then we re-implement the good inclusion game. And you can see that that again increased the level of inclusive interactions. So now this is kind of suggesting here, yeah, this is something to do with the good inclusion game. This does not appear to be just happening over time. It's something to do with this intervention. And then we went back to telling the students to help share and care for each other, praising them for doing so. And when I say we, I mean the teacher did that. And you can see what that produced. And then we finished the session with 3 sessions of the good inclusion game. So as you can see, there's a functional relation between the good inclusion game and increases in helping interactions. And by functional relation, all I mean is when we play the game, there's increases, and when we take it away, there's decreases. Now, remember, we also had that other dependent variable, the umbrella term of inclusive interactions. So this is kind of the data that Coyle and Dillenberger would have here on the screen. However, we included the positive or general interactions with that inclusive measure, and we can see what that would also produce. And really the difference between those 2 data points is that positive and general interaction. And what this shows is that the good inclusion game probably increases the inclusivity of the classroom to a greater extent than that even reported by Coyle and Dillenberger. So not only does the good inclusion game increase helping interactions, but also an overall inclusivity within the classroom environment. Now, I said I did want to talk about variability in the data set, so let's just do that, because there's a lot of variability in all of my data sets. And to talk about variability, let's just look at the original baseline helping interactions for now. So some may not know what I mean by variability, so I'll just explain what I mean. Really what I mean is sometimes the data is going up, and sometimes it's going down, and sometimes it's going up, and sometimes it's going down. And indeed, you see this across all of the phases, including the good inclusion game. So there's a reason for this. The reason for this is we did not control the difficulty of the task that was presented during these sessions. Rather, the teacher gave out what she had already planned. And there was a number of reasons for doing this. One of the main reasons being that teachers were kind of striking in Northern Ireland when I was doing my research, and we didn't want to add any additional burden to the teachers. So we just, in an effort to work collaboratively with them, we went ahead with whatever it was that they were presenting that day, and we ran our experiment alongside that. So with that, sometimes the sessions would change in difficulty. So sometimes the lesson, the assignment would be quite easy, and sometimes it would be quite difficult. And with this, the need for help would obviously change. Sometimes the need for help would be decreased, and other times it would be increased. So if the task was, let's say, difficult, this would increase the need for help, and it's very likely that we saw this increase in helping interactions, such as these 2 data points here. However, if the task was easy, this likely reduced the need for help and probably explains data points such as these 2 here. So I tell you that to point out that when we're looking at these data, the best indicator of effectiveness may not be looking, or sorry, it may be looking at the change in the level of responding across conditions rather than the variability and trend as such within. And this is something that's extremely important to be mindful of when looking at my data, and it's something that I will continuously bring your attention to as we look at my data sets. So there's one way, or there's multiple ways, I guess, but what we're going to look at here is what's called a weighted average level of responding to show the change in the level of responding across conditions. So what we'll do here is we'll just compare baseline to the good inclusion game. And to calculate the weighted average level of responding, what you do is you take the average level of responding in the original baseline condition, and then you take the average level of responding in the other baseline condition, and you add those 2 together, and it gives you a number of 28.2 here. You then divide that number by the total number of conditions that you looked at, and in this case, 2 baseline conditions, and that gives you this score. And this score, 14.1%, is our average level of helping interactions observed across baseline conditions. And of course, we can do the same calculation for the good inclusion game. And we see that when we do that calculation for the good inclusion game, the average level of responding was 46.6%. In other words, 46.6% of the intervals scored had helping interactions in them. Now, we can also look at the magnitude of the change in the level of helping interactions by dividing the average percentage of intervals scored with helping interactions observed during the good inclusion game by the average percentage of intervals scored with helping interactions during the baseline conditions. And when we do that, we see that we have a magnitude change of 3.3. So, in other words, we have 3 times more helping interactions during the good inclusion game compared to baseline conditions. And of course, we can do similar calculations for the inclusive interactions, the overall umbrella dimension that we're looking at here as well. So in baseline, we had 28% of the intervals scored with inclusive interactions, and that increased to 56.9%, which was a magnitude change of 2.1. So 2 times more inclusive interactions during the good inclusion game. And as you can see then, the good inclusion game increased inclusive and helping interactions between our target SEND student and their peers. And that's lovely, that's fantastic, that's what we want to see. And of course, throughout the study, we talked treatment integrity and IOA, but I'll not bore you with that for now. That can be a lesson for another day. And we took social validity measures at the end. So we asked the parents and guardians what they thought of their target behaviours, helping, sharing, and caring. We talked to our teachers about the intervention in terms of the outcomes and the goals and the target behaviours, and we asked the students what they thought of the game as well. And overall, we found that the intervention was found to be socially valid among all of those that we asked. And what this data does, it shows us that the good inclusion game can help teachers with at least 2 of the 3 concerns that we discussed at the start of the presentation. And in terms of the questions we had, we found that the good inclusion game is effective over a prolonged period of time or over multiple sessions, and that it's more effective than simply just telling the students to help, share, and care for each other and praising them for doing so. Now, the study wasn't without its limitations. Unfortunately, we noted that some students appeared to be distracted by the scoreboard, Unfortunately, we noted some negative remarks being made between teams, such as, hey, you're going to lose, our team's the best. And the teacher stated that sometimes she found it difficult to monitor both teams, award points to both teams, and just simply be a teacher. One interesting point in support of the empirical data of Coyle and Dillenberger is that we observed that disruptive behaviors appeared to reduce during sessions in which the game was implemented. However, we didn't have data to show this. And these limitations led to our next study that we're going to look at here tonight. So in our second study, we had two questions. The first question, what are the effects of playing the good inclusion game in teams versus one big team? And, this is important because it potentially can avoid those negative comments made between teams. But I believe it's a really important social question, because I would argue that if effective, the good inclusion game as one big team is actually more aligned with the essence of inclusion, as we're not segregating students up into teams. And our second question was, does the good inclusion game function as a class-wide behaviour management strategy? So in this study, we had two classrooms. In our first classroom, we had 11 pupils from whom we had assent and consent. And then in these classrooms, there were more pupils or more students, but these are the ones whom we had assent and consent. They were aged between 10 and 11 years old. And our target SEND student in this case was male, and like myself, had a diagnosis of dyslexia. And we had a male teacher. In our second classroom, it was quite similar. We had 11 students. They were 1 year younger. However, in this classroom, none of the parents or guardians provided consent for the school to provide me with the diagnosis of their children. So I cannot confirm nor deny that our target student in this case was or had a special education need. In this classroom, I simply asked the teacher to identify whom she thought, she thought was could benefit most from this intervention. And we had a female teacher in this classroom. Now, we measured the same dependent variables or behaviors to the previous experiment. However, now we also measured disruptive behaviors. And we measured that using frequency, and that was a class-wide measure. Now, in this line of research, researchers typically record out-of-seat behavior and shouting out behaviors as disruptive. However, we broke away from that convention for two main reasons. First, the nature of the behaviors we were measuring in terms of the interactions. So as you can imagine, because I need to ensure that the students are asking for help and offering help, I need to sit quite close to my target SEND student in order to hear what is coming out of their mouth. And I also have to listen quite intently, because sometimes classrooms can be loud and I really need to pay attention to what is being said between these students. And that's what that was about. And as I'm paying attention to the student interactions, it's possible that another kid at the other side of the room may have asked the teacher for permission to get out of seat, and therefore was given permission to get out of seat. And if I looked up and saw a child out of seat and measured that as disruptive behavior, it's not really. So we didn't do that. The other reason why we didn't measure just out of seat behavior as disruptive is that some research suggests that some students can benefit from movement breaks, and teachers are okay with this typically. And again, it may not be fair to record that type of out of seat behavior as disruptive as such. So what we did was we measured disruptive behaviors by actually measuring those types of behaviors, out of seat behavior, for example, but it also had to be followed by a corrective statement or action from the teacher. So I would have to see a kid out of their seat, for example, and the teacher say, "Hey, Scott, please sit down. I've told you before." And again, at the end of the study, we took social validity measures, and throughout the study, we took treatment integrity and IOA. So here, what I want to do is just bring your attention to a couple of things. First of all, the top panel here is Classroom 1, bottom panel is Classroom 2. And really what I want to point out here is that it's important to note that we counterbalance the interventions or the iterations of the interventions across the two classrooms. So the top classroom, or Classroom 1, was first exposed to the one-team version of the intervention, and then the teams version of the good inclusion game. And this order was reversed for the second classroom. Now, again, let me tell you a little bit about the baseline conditions within these classrooms. To be honest, in the first classroom, it was quite similar to the previous classroom that we talked about. There was really just praise and reprimands for appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Unfortunately, let me just show you the data, and I'm going to show you the inclusive interaction data path and the helping interaction data path at the same time. And by this stage, you should have an idea of what the good inclusion game looks like. The only difference here is that in the first good inclusion game phase, it's played as one big team, and then in the second phase, it's played as two. So here are the data. And as you can see, both iterations of the good inclusion game increase inclusive and helping interactions, basically to the same extent as well. Now, what we're going to do now is just look at the helping interactions, because that's truly the main aim of the good inclusion game, and because we don't have all night to look at my data. So let's just look at the helping interactions. And again, here we can look at the change in the level of responding. Now, because technically we have two interventions, the one team version and the teams version, rather than taking the average level of responding across baseline, we'll just look at the changes in the level of responding across successive phases. So in the original initial baseline phase, helping interactions were recorded within 10% of the intervals. And then this increased to 37.3%. And that was a magnitude change of 3.7. So almost 4 times more help during the good inclusion game, one team. In the second baseline phase, helping interactions were recorded within 7% of the total intervals, and this increased to 31%. So a magnitude change of 4.3. Remember, all we're doing here to get this magnitude change is dividing the percentage in the good inclusion game by the percentage in the baseline conditions and multiplying by 100. So that's why we have a bigger magnitude change, because there were lower levels in that second baseline phase. Another thing we started to look at with these studies is, well, who's initiating the interactions? So on the next figure, you see the initiations across conditions. So what we have here is the SEND student requesting help of the peers requesting help from the SEND student student offering help to the peers offering help to the SEND student initiating positive and general interactions, and then the same for the peers in terms of talking to the SEND student. And let's just look at the helping interactions for now. So what do we see? Well, first, if we look at peers requesting help from the SEND student and the SEND student offering help to the peers, we see that there was some, but not much change. However, if we look at the SEND student requesting help from the peers and the peers offering help to the SEND student, we see a lot of change in this classroom. And I absolutely loved this pattern, because what this shows me is that the good inclusion game is helping the SEND student to self-advocate, in that they're asking for help more for themselves. And it's shown that the peers are checking in on the SEND student more often, asking, does he or she need more help? You doing okay? In other words, what it's doing here is creating a community of caring. And I thought that was absolutely lovely that we found those data. And now let's look at classroom 2. So in this classroom, I'll give you a little bit more detail of what I observed in baseline. So what I observed in this classroom was the teachers sometimes counting down from 5 to manage disruptive behaviors. So she'd go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hoping that the kids would settle. Other times, she would tell the students to stop and put their hands on their head. And these were kind of her go-to behavior management strategies. And I also noticed that on the board, she had a points system. And I asked her about this. And she told me that the students could get points for being on task, participating, and helping. So this showed me that this teacher was really trying to encourage helping interactions between her students. And what she told me was that sometimes, depending on how she felt, she gives points to individual students. In other words, an independent group contingency. And so that's a group contingency in which reinforcement for each student is contingent upon each student's own behavior. So sometimes she would do that. Now, she didn't call it an independent group contingency. I'm just telling you what she would do. And at other times, she gave points to the table of students. In other words, an interdependent group contingency. Now, so again, just before I show you the data in this classroom, I'll bring your attention to something. I just want to remind you that in this classroom, the order of the conditions was reversed. So they first got the teams version of the good inclusion game and then the one team version. And again, here are the effects of the interventions. So as you can see, again, both iterations or variations of the interventions had similar effects. And again, we can look at the change in the level of helping interactions here to just look at this a little bit more statistically. So in baseline, the average level of helping interactions was 11%. This increased to 34.2% with the teams version of the good inclusion game, which was a magnitude change of 3.1. So 3 times more help observed during the teams version of the good inclusion game. We went back to baseline and it also fell back to 7.6% and then increased to 34.7%, which was a magnitude change of 4.6. Again, about 4.5 times more help and interactions observed during the game. And again, we can look at who initiated the interactions. So here you'll see that instead of saying, I've written the word Jack because I wasn't told if this kid had a special education need or not. So Jack's just a fake name to highlight that difference. But what you see here is that Jack was requesting and offering more help during the good inclusion game and making more positive and general initiations. And we can see the same for his peers. Now, remember, we also wanted to look at the effects of the good inclusion game on disruptive behaviors. So here are the effects, and here I'll just show the data like this. So you can see here also that both variations of the good inclusion game also functioned as a class-wide behavior management strategy. So not only are you getting increases in help and sharing and caring, you're getting a more settled classroom. In terms of which was most effective, across the 2 classrooms, we had inconsistent findings. The teams version was most effective in classroom 1, and the one team version was most effective in classroom 2. However, really the difference between teams and one team within each classroom was minor at best. There really wasn't much difference. And again, we found that the interventions overall were found to be socially valid among parents, guardians, the teachers, and the students. One thing I was particularly interested in was which version of the game the teachers liked best. And when asked, both teachers selected that one team version. And this was due to the fact that it was easier to implement and the fact that under this one team paradigm, playing the game as in one big team, either all the students earned access to the reward or prize, or none of the students did. So it was potentially perceived as being more fair. And what this study did is shows us again that the good inclusion game can now help teachers with all three of the concerns that we discussed at the start of the presentation. I say again because Coyle and Dallenberger did demonstrate, at least with one session, that the good inclusion game could reduce disruptive behaviors. So to this point in the presentation tonight, we have found that the good inclusion game is effective over a prolonged period of time or over a number of sessions. It's more effective than simply just telling students to help each other and praising them for doing so, which is what we typically find in classrooms, to be honest, I think. The good inclusion game functions as a class-wide behavior management strategy, and it does not require social competition between teams. And this last point is really, really important. So let me explain. The last point is important because some of the teachers, sometimes, not always, felt that sometimes the intervention could be unfair. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So although teachers typically have independent group contingencies in place in which rewards are given to some students who meet the criterion and not other students who do not meet the criterion, these teachers felt that some students getting a reward while playing the game and other students not was sometimes unfair. So again, let me explain through visuals what I mean by that. So in the independent group contingency, which is often in place in classrooms, only the students who meet the criterion earn their reward. So for example, I'm sure we can all think of times where if you completed your homework, you got some type of reward. Well, that was only if you completed your homework. And I was often the kid here with the red X, and I didn't get those rewards. However, with the interdependent group contingency, which is embedded within the good inclusion game, this changes. When playing the teams version of the good inclusion game, we take the class and we split it up into two teams. And then we apply the criterion to each team. So let's say that all of these students here do a great job, whatever that may be. And collectively, they meet the criterion and therefore earn access to that reward. So that's fantastic. However, in team two, let's say the students don't do so well. However, the first kid does fantastic. Excuse me. But as a team, they do not earn their reward. Well, in this case, sometimes the teachers were saying that they felt it was unfair on this student here, which is fair enough. That's a limitation to what we're doing here with the teams. And a limitation of that reward component, if you will, if you want to look at it that way as well. And of course, there were other limitations, or there are other limitations to the reward component as well, especially if it was a tangible reward, which it wasn't always. As I said, the teacher determined what it was. But if it was a tangible reward, some other limitations are that we would have to interrupt the class to distribute the reward. So this takes time. Also, if we give a toy or a small tangible to kids, sometimes they will leave it on their desk, and this can serve to distract them throughout the remainder of the day. And of course, if it's tangible, there's a cost component. So these limitations here really got me thinking about the reinforcement component of the good inclusion game. And a consequence that increases the future probability of that behavior occurring again and again in the future. I guess I said that. So with that knowledge of what reinforcement is, I started to think outside of the prize box, if you will. And I wondered what would happen if the reward was simply to graph the number of points earned in a session. And this would be kind of like self-monitoring, which anyone may do if trying to lose weight or trying to run a marathon. You might monitor how many miles you've run. And we could graph the points, and then you could add a component or a competition component to it, in that the goal might be to try and beat your high score as a class, your previous high score. So I sat and I thought about this for a while, and then I thought, well, let's just do a study on it. So in this last study that we're going to look at here tonight, we had two questions again. And the first question was, can we replicate the findings of the one-team version of the good inclusion game? And will graphing points earned function as reinforcement? So everything was exactly the same, only at the end, rather than getting a tangible or extra break time, a student got the opportunity to graph the number of points that the class earned and then determine if they beat the high score or not, or the previous high score. So in this study, we had two classrooms. The first classroom had 11 pupils, aged 9 to 10 years old, and our target SEND student was male, had cognitive learning difficulties and social, emotional, behavioral difficulties. And we had a female teacher. In classroom 2, we had 19 pupils, 10 to 11 years old, and our target SEND student was female with hearing difficulties and ADHD. And we had a male teacher throughout the study. Again, at the end, we took social validity measures, and throughout the study, we took treatment integrity and IOA. So here, I'm just going to show you the data, I'm just showing you the order of the conditions again. So we had baseline, and then the good inclusion game with graphing points earned, and then baseline, and then the good inclusion game with graphing points earned. So baseline, what did that look like? Quite similar. However, I observed praise and reprimands, and both teachers in both classrooms often trying to encourage the students to help each other more by saying phrases such as ask 3 before me, as in ask 3 of your friends before you come and ask me as the teacher. So again, in both of these classrooms, in the baseline conditions, they were trying to encourage more helping interactions between all of the students. So now let's look at the data in classroom 1. So again, here you see a functional relation between the good inclusion game and increases in helping interactions and inclusive interactions. And again, by functional relation, all I mean is these behaviors increased when we played the game and they decreased when we took it away. So there's something here in this intervention doing this. And again, we can just look at the helping interactions for now to see the change in the level. So here, because we have one intervention, we can look at the average level of responding across the conditions again. So in baseline, we observed there was a low level of helping interactions within this classroom, just under 6% during baseline, and this increased to 25.5%, which was a magnitude change of 4.3. So over 4 times more help during the good inclusion game. Now this is lower than the previous data points that we looked at. So some of them were up around the 30s. But this is still a respectful increase and a respectful number during the good inclusion game. What this is saying here is the students were helping each other 25% of the time. And you have to remember that during these sessions, not only are the students expected to help each other, but they're also expected to complete their own work. So this is a realistic number. We really don't want the data to be up at 90 to 100% of intervals. That would be helping far too much, and your schoolwork would suffer. So this is, although a lower number, it's still very much a realistic, appropriate level of helping interactions, I would argue. And again, we looked at who's initiating these interactions, and when we did that, we again saw this pattern of the SEND student asking for more help from his peers and the peers offering more help to the SEND student. So again, we've created a community and a classroom of caring. And then in classroom 2, let's look at the data. So there's a couple of things I want to say about this data set. First, in the first baseline phase, there was absolutely no interactions with the SEND student at all. And then you can see that it increased and then decreased when we went back to baseline and then increased again. You also notice that there's very little differentiation between the two data paths, showing that there was very little to no positive or general interactions, really just helping interactions, even with the good inclusion game graphing points earned. So let's look at the change in the level of helping interactions as a result of the good inclusion game. So during baseline, extremely low levels of helping interactions between our target SEND student and her peers, and then this increased to 26.4%, which, given that there was such a low level in baseline, was a massive magnitude change of 18.9. So almost 19 times more help observed during the good inclusion game. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is that the level of help in the second phase was not as high as the first. And you might be wondering, well, why is that? And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure, but I have two possible explanations. First, I have reason to believe that the tasks in the second phase were easier. A review of the SEND students' work following sessions in the second phase showed that she typically got all of the answers correct. So there's less need for help. And this corresponded with less helping initiations in the second phase. Interestingly, most notably with the SEND student offering help to her peers. So we have to get out of this mindset of thinking SEND kids cannot help non-SEND kids. This kid was actually helping quite a bit. There's also perhaps related to the tasks being easier in the second phase overall is that there was a change in the type of helping interactions from the first phase to the second phase. In the first phase, many of the requests for help were concerned with the assignments itself. So actually looking at the work and spending time together, engaging with the work. However, in the second phase, with the tasks being possibly easier, there was less of those types of helping interactions, but they consisted more of things like, hey, can you pass the ruler? Can you pass the rubber? And those types of interactions are of a lesser duration and much shorter, because you can pass me the rubber within 2 seconds. However, it's coming over and help me with my task, you might actually spend some time with me. It could be 30 seconds, a minute. And that brings down the overall percentage of intervals scored. So perhaps that's the reason the tasks were easier. Unfortunately, during the second intervention phase, there were some examples of these exclusionary behaviors. There was one instance in which the SEND student requested help and was ignored. However, compared to the first intervention phase, what appeared to be happening more so is that the peers were simply just not engaging with the SEND student as much, whilst continuing to earn points. So let me explain what I mean by that. And this in itself highlights the importance of why we took data at that individual level in these studies. So if you remember, these are our students, and this kid here with the yellow box is our SEND student, and we're recording these interactions. However, there's the peer-to-peer interactions ongoing, but we're just recording these. Now, to earn points, the class obviously does not have to engage with the target SEND student. That would be really stigmatizing. Rather, anyone can earn points for helping anyone. So the teacher may see this interaction here, for example, and reward a point. And unfortunately, what this does, it allows the students to continue earning points while effectively excluding particular students. And in this case, I really think that this pattern of behaviors started to emerge in that second phase. So it's very likely that in the second phase, we have a lower level of helping interactions due to probably 2 reasons. First, the tasks appeared to be easier and therefore less of a need for help. And there was also what appeared to be a resurfacing of exclusionary behaviors on behalf of the peers. Now, an extended second intervention phase would have allowed us to draw stronger conclusions on that. However, it was not possible to do that because we were coming to the end of the academic year. It was summertime. Nevertheless, this is an important finding and one that teachers ought to be made aware of, in that students can continue to engage in exclusionary practices even when playing the good inclusion game. So teachers really have to keep an eye out for that. This is not a magic intervention as such. However, I still don't believe that these findings in this second classroom should be understated. So for example, if we look at the peers initiations with the SEND student, just here, we see that there's extremely low levels of initiations in baseline. And don't be fooled by those little grey bars. The zero is actually elevated off the x-axis. There was actually no initiations at all during baseline. So I'll leave it up to you to consider what it must feel like to go from no one ever initiating an interaction with you to at least sometimes interacting with you. And here are the effects of the good inclusion game with graphing points earned on disruptive behaviours. So you can see that the intervention also functioned as a class-wide behaviour management strategy to an extent. And in terms of social validity, we got mixed outcomes here. Overall, the students appeared to enjoy the game. They really enjoyed it. However, the teacher's social validity was not as positive. Only the teacher in classroom 1 completed the questionnaire, stating that she agreed with the goals of the intervention, increasing helping, sharing and caring. However, she was unsure if the intervention was easy to use, if it was helpful, and if she would play it again. That's okay. Our social validity measurement then allow us to follow up on those answers. And here I've just put a picture in of what the reward looked like for each classroom. So this is what they were doing. They graphed the number of points that they earned, and this was simply it. So you can see here in classroom 2 and game 4, they earned like 11, maybe 12 points, and that was their high score. And then they were continuously trying to beat that high score. And unfortunately for them, they never did. So what's this say? It shows us now that we can also say that graphing points earned can also function as reinforcement. So if you have a teacher that's concerned with giving extra break time and extra computer time and extra, little toys and items, we can say, well, here, we can just graph the points earned and make it a little game like that. And this has been found to be effective. And I'm almost done here. So here are some of the social validity comments from the students. So teachers, if you are in the room, listen up, because these kids are now talking to you. So it wasn't all positive. One student said, sometimes I helped and we didn't get a point. So, that sucks, but the teacher can't see everything. But it was mostly positive. One student said, it gave me a boost. That's fantastic. These contingencies are creating positive experiences and positive emotions and feelings within the classroom. It created a good learning environment. We're not competing to get work done, which is fantastic. Sometimes students are competing and not sharing and rushing through work and also just making mistakes as well because they're trying to get it done first. So that avoided that. And one other student said, I got loads of work done. So wrapping up, there's a couple of things I just want to say, 2 more slides. The first is, these data suggest that the good inclusion game can help teachers achieve many of the indicators of moving towards inclusion in the classroom, suggested by UNESCO, thus hopefully creating a more inclusive education environment for all. And the last thing is this, the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education states that the merit of such schools, inclusive schools, is not only that they are capable of providing quality education to all children. Their establishment is a crucial step in helping to change discriminatory attitudes, in creating welcoming communities, and in developing inclusive societies. So with that, I'll leave you with the question of, is there a greater way of creating a welcoming community than teaching children at a young age to interact pro-socially with one another and to offer help to those in need? Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you very much.